Sounds like our next session is going to hit home for so many of our viewers.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Emoju. It's officially about time for our next session. It's building Stripe's remote hub, scaling distributed teams, which is really timely right now with everything that's going on with COVID. That's going to be presented by observability engineer and remote hub site lead at Stripe, Aditya Mukerjee. Aditya has tons of experience making remote collaboration possible. Aditya set up remote engineering work policies across Stripe as it grew to nearly 200 remote engineers. So this session is really, really timely, as we mentioned. It's going to be great. I'm excited. Aditya, you're up.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aditya, and I work on the reliability team at Stripe on observability work. I've also been working remotely at Stripe for the past 5 years now, actually. And for the last year, I've also been the site lead for Stripe's remote hub. It's funny, Stripe started this initiative of having a remote hub just over a year ago. So I've been thinking for a while of how to talk about it publicly. But that all got upended about 2 months ago, because it used to be a question of how to convince people to try remote work. And now everyone, like even New York City public school teachers, are working remotely, teaching third graders from their homes. I don't think anyone could really have predicted that just even 6 months ago. So now that it feels like everyone is working remotely, these are the two most important questions that I can help you answer today based on our first year of having a remote hub at Stripe. First, why should remote work be our long-term strategy instead of just a short-term contingency? And that's a question that a lot of companies are asking at the executive level. Even if you're working remotely today due to COVID-19, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily planning to continue that long-term once it's safe to work in offices again. So for those of you on the fence, I'm here to tell you why you should open a remote hub as well, why you should actively plan for remote work being a first-class strategy alongside your physical offices. On the flip side, if you're sold on permanent remote work but aren't sure how to convince your company of it, this is also the talk for you. The second question is more of a general question. Once we've made the decision to work remotely and treat remote work as a pillar of our engineering strategy, how do we do it right? So today, I'm here to share with you the strategies that we've used at Stripe to grow our remote hub, both in its size and also in the impact that remote teams have had. We already had some remote engineers before that. I was one of them, but remote engineering was something that at Stripe we happened to support, not a core pillar of our engineering strategy. That is until January of 2019, when we launched the remote hub, our fifth engineering hub, coequal with our other 4 engineering hubs in San Francisco, Seattle, Dublin, and Singapore. And the reason that we opened a virtual engineering hub that would be remote, I think our CTO nails it in the announcement, the opening. He says our users are everywhere, so we have to be as well. And at Stripe, our mission is to increase the GDP of the internet. And the internet is global, so we need people who understand what our users are going through in very disparate economies all around the world, what it's like just on the ground. So that's a great reason for Stripe to build a remote hub and have people all around the world, but that may not apply to everyone. Maybe you're focused on a local market, or maybe your company is planning on growing in a bootstrap manner instead of taking venture money. So why should having a remote hub be part of your engineering strategy as well? If you take away nothing else from this talk, I hope it's this slide. When you're forming your company's cultures and norms, remember that that the best practices for operating remotely at scale are also the best practices for operating at scale, period. If you want to create an efficient, resilient, highly available engineering organization and have software architecture that matches that, you're going to end up doing at least 80% of what's needed in order to enable remote work for your engineers. In the end, many teams will actually end up being able to operate remotely. Maybe not every single person on every single team, but a lot of them will, because the engineering practices that you're going to need in order to scale will set you up for that. And conversely, an engineering team that's heavily optimized for in-person workflows is going to need to adapt those strategies in order to maintain that same level of flexibility at scale. And as it turns out, those adaptations are mostly the same ones that facilitate remote work. We can put this in engineering terms as well. Would you rather have to do a zero downtime migration of some fundamental piece of infrastructure and wait to do this until you hit scale? Or would you rather make flexible and scalable decisions from the very start? As engineers, we know migrations are a pain, especially zero downtime migrations. And so, since it's much harder to change working practices than it is to establish good habits from the beginning, why not keep an eye on remote friendly workflows from the start? Even if you don't adopt them all from the beginning, keeping an eye on those as a goal will give you a framework to help you in the moment make decisions that are going to then scale long term. Now, sometimes people are hesitant. They think that remote work causes problems. You'd hear this often, especially 6 months, a year ago, that we tried remote work, but it led to communication breakdown, or it led to culture split. Their productivity was an issue. And while I think that those are valid concerns, I also think that there's a more constructive way to look at it. Your company is a dynamic system, just like the human body. You have multiple organs that are working together, just like teams in your company, to accomplish a broader goal. And sometimes there are issues either with an isolated organ or with the way that different organs work together with each other. So one tool that's used to diagnose those issues is nuclear medicine. That's actually the term. So let's say there's an issue with your kidneys, your renal system, how your body's processing water. So what doctors will have you do is swallow a small amount of basically radioactive water. That's mildly radioactive, but it's technically radioactive water. And your body will treat that exactly the same way that it treats any other water that you'd ingest. You'll swallow it, it'll go through your stomach, your kidneys will process it and so forth. But with one key difference, because it's radioactive, that water will show up bright and fluorescent on a certain type of imaging scan. So you can actually see if there are any issues with how your kidneys are functioning. So what we found is that remote work is like having these fluorescent indicators. It will shine a light on any scaling inefficiencies in your workflows, like undocumented practices or low bus factors, and they'll become visible very quickly. That doesn't mean that working remotely causes those issues or that working remotely is an issue of scale. It's on the contrary. Adapting to remote work will make your engineering organization more elastic and scalable by shining a light on those issues earlier on in the process when it's still much easier for you to change them. As a friendly note, everything we're talking about here is an example, so please don't actually swallow any radioactive water, or for that matter, anything radioactive, unless you have doctor supervision. And while this other note might sound obvious as well, I think it's worth being explicit on. If you're running into issues with remote work today, that's expected, and that's normal. You probably weren't planning for this, so you're still currently operating in reaction mode rather than in planning mode. Even at Stripe, where we were planning ahead for remote work, we've still had hiccups over the last 2 months trying to transition that to have the entire organization working remotely simultaneously. And for all of us, we're not just working at home. We're at home during a global pandemic trying to work. So it's easy to attribute any problems that we encounter to remote work, but really, there are a lot of confounding factors here. So it's important to cut yourselves and also your colleagues some slack along the way. Now, here comes the interesting part, the answer to that second question. How do we work effectively as remote teams? So at the beginning of last year, I laid out 3 key goals that I wanted to accomplish in our first year of having a remote hub at Stripe. I wanted to expand the breadth of teams that were hiring remote engineers. I wanted to improve the work experience for remote engineers. And I wanted to recruit and hire more remote engineers. So if you're looking to make remote engineering a long-term strategy at your company today, these are probably the right 3 goals to set for your first year. But of course, the question is how to get there. And I won't have time to share with you all the different projects we worked on to accomplish all of these goals, but I'm definitely happy to chat separately with anyone who's interested later in the discussions here or offline. And of course, in the coming weeks, we also plan on publishing a more in-depth look for people who want to peel back and do a deep dive. But since every company's situation is different, what I'll do now is give you a framework that will be applicable to you on your team as you figure out the right way to tackle these goals for yourselves. At Stripe, we're meticulous about the foundations. We like to reason from first principles, and we collect data to inform our decisions. And then that data also helps us know when to revise or shift our focus along the way. So I already outlined the key goals that I wanted to accomplish for the year. So then we begin with our initial hypotheses about those goals. We then collect data or evidence from the different projects that we embark on to try and accomplish those goals. Those are basically the experiments that we're running. And then most importantly, we have the findings, the results that we learned from each step along the way. So by sharing with you this framework that we used and that we still use and showing you how we applied it, I hope I can give you something practical that you can take back to your companies and apply to your own unique situations as well. So the first goal I had was to expand the breadth of teams hiring remote engineers. And we all know what a challenge that hiring can be. If you ask a hiring manager, would you like to expand the pool of candidates that you're able to consider and hire by 10,000 fold? Of course they're going to say absolutely, but that doesn't mean that they're actually necessarily going to go out there and start posting remote roles for their teams or actively recruiting remote candidates to fill those roles. Because we had a chicken and egg problem. Some teams had been remote friendly for a while, but some also had zero remotes. And so we needed a plan to transition teams from going from zero remotes to one or more remotes on a team. So the first thing I did was to collate a guide of the common practices that were already used by teams that were working remotely at Stripe. And this wasn't anything that they coordinated in advance. This was just figuring out what patterns and habits they'd settled into naturally and finding the lowest common denominator among them. We plan on sharing this guide in the future, but as a preview, most of it centered around the team communication norms and especially meeting styles. To give you an example, one thing that we recommend for all teams that have remote people on them is reserve at least one of your meetings a week to be all remote. So everyone dials in remotely. Even if you have 5 people who are working in an office and 3 people who work remotely, don't have those 5 people sit in the conference room for one meeting a week. Have everyone dial in from their laptops separately, including them. That puts everyone on the same page, so everyone's feeling the exact same barriers, so it's a level playing field. Another meeting style we recommend for teams to use whenever it's helpful is called the silent meeting. So a good use of it is if you're reviewing a design document or a project brief together, you reserve the first third of the meeting for everyone to sit on a conference call together, but in silence. And everyone is collaboratively editing and commenting on a Google Doc together, and they'll responding to each other's comments and working semi-synchronously. And then the rest of the meeting, you talk about the stuff that you'd edited and the discussions that you'd had in the comments. The advantage of this meeting style is it gives people a little bit more time to collect their thoughts and respond appropriately, and it addresses some of the issues you sometimes have in meetings, both online and offline, where people are interrupting each other or feel like they're not necessarily getting heard, and which get amplified over the latency of a video call. And this instead gives people an asynchronous, or semi-synchronous way of talking beforehand, and then a basis from which to have the conversations. So we took this guide, and then I gave it to managers who are interested in adapting to remote work, and he told them to adopt these practices as a team as a prerequisite to opening up to remote work. Because in order to be successful, you need everyone to be on board, whether or not they are personally working remotely. It's not just the job of remote engineers to make sure that the team supports remote work. Everyone has to be involved as well. And so as part of getting everyone on board, it helped that we were able to show them how our existing workflows set them up for remote work. Because nobody wants to feel like a guinea pig, but everyone wants to feel like they're trying something new. So we could truthfully tell them, look, we're not asking you to make a huge shift here. We're just asking you to be a bit more conscious and intentional about the things you're already doing, and then tweak them in a few ways that other teams have found is helpful when easing the transition to remote work. So the second goal I had was to improve the work experience for remote engineers. And we had the hypothesis that having a remote landing team can help cement your team's culture as it shifts to remote work. So what we began with a pilot program where we actually offered, we told a small number of engineers in the San Francisco office that they could work remotely from their homes in the Bay Area for 3 months as a pilot program. They'd still be based in, they'd still be working on teams that are based in San Francisco, but they wouldn't come into the office, and they'd effectively be remote. And that gave them a taste of what it's like to work remotely. And it also gave their teams a preview of what it would be like to have remote team members. And the pilot was a huge success. In fact, I believe every single person who participated in it opted to continue working remotely even after the pilot had ended. And this set us up quite well when COVID-19 hit, because we already knew what to expect when asking people to transition to working remotely from working in an office. Of course, one of those situations is voluntary and one wasn't, but it still gave us a baseline, something that we could, a starting point. The second hypothesis I had is that being distributed across separate offices is not actually all that different from being distributed remotely. So we could leverage the same strategies and workflows that made us successful as a globally distributed company with offices all around the world, and use those to be successful with a remote hub as well. Because we already had offices, including engineering offices around the world. And while most teams are located in a single office, most work crosses multiple teams. So people are already used to collaborating with people who work in different locations. And if you're in New York doing a one-on-one video conference call, there's not really a big difference between calling someone who's based out of an office in London or calling someone who's working out of their home in rural Scotland. The same time zone, it's the same barriers with video conference calls. It's all functionally the same. So as part of learning to work across offices, we'd already adopted both the tools for synchronous communication across distances and also asynchronous tools for most of our work. So we don't do code review by looking over someone's shoulder. We use GitHub. We don't do sprint planning by using Post-it notes in a conference room. We use Jira. We don't do product development on a whiteboard. We use Google Docs. And these are things that we adopted long before we created the Remote Hub. We did them because they're generally good development practices, but also because people needed them in order to work effectively across offices. And we found that these translate very directly towards remote work as well. This slide here is my favorite section, and it's not just because I'm a reliability engineer. When a company is very small, it's also my favorite because I think it demonstrates very clearly how having remote work can be actually a force multiplier for your company. So when a company is very small, it's common to have on-call and incident response be handled in a synchronous manner. So people sitting side by side physically next to each other and working to mitigate an issue. And there was a period early in Stripe's history where this was true for us as well. But as we grew, we needed to scale our process. We couldn't afford to have knowledge that was spread via word of mouth, and we couldn't afford to have low bus factors. So as we became more rigorous about documenting the operations of our systems so that people everywhere could use them, our incidents response process quickly became distributed as well. And this happened long before the creation of the Remote Hub. It was just a function of what we needed to do to scale. And it's very difficult to scale an organization remotely and still have a low bus factor. So if you play it right, you can actually do it even earlier than we did. Use building a remote org as a forcing function for having good resiliency engineering ahead of time. So what did we learn from our efforts to improve work experience for remote engineers? Well, it became clear that building a remote hub means building great remote teams. It means setting people up for success regardless of where they happen to be working. And fortunately, the best workflows are largely the same, both for remote and non-remote teams. You need to create discoverable records of information. And we were already prepared for remote software engineering practices because we'd already had to enable these as part of scaling as a globally distributed organization. And whether or not you're looking to scale globally as well, you can still use remote work as a forcing function in that direction. So the final goal I had was to recruit and actually hire more remote engineers. And at the time that we launched the Remote Hub, My hypothesis was that most engineering roles can actually be hired remotely as long as the team and the manager are committed to it. That's the key prerequisite. Because we don't view the responsibility of remote work as a one-way street. Remote work is as much about setting people up for success as it is about the people who are working remotely. So what we did as an experiment was we, to collect data on this, we codified and we simplified the requirements for working remotely. Previously, we'd expected candidates for remote roles to have prior experience working remotely at another company earlier. But as we just saw, a lot of the skills for working effectively while remote are really just general engineering skills. So knowing how to use code review tools, use project management software, or even just communicating effectively and clearly in prose and in written documents. Those are all things that are essential to remote work, but they're also essential for success in more senior engineering roles as well. So instead, we decided that for engineering roles in the remote hub, we would consider more experienced or senior engineering applicants, regardless of whether or not they had prior remote experience. For new graduates, people, for example, someone who's fresh out of school and accepting their first full-time job, we still would look for prior remote experience when applying to a role in the remote hub. And that doesn't mean that we believe that those roles couldn't be done remotely. It just meant that at the time we made this change a year ago, we weren't confident that we would be able to provide the support and the career growth resources for someone who is new to both full-time employment and to working remotely. The data here speaks for itself. By the end of the year, we had nearly 200 remote engineers at Stripe, accounting for 1/5 of the engineering organization. And of course, as of today, all of Stripe engineers, in fact, the entire company, is working remotely as well. And the current situation isn't permanent. We do plan on reopening our offices. But the fact that Stripe engineers have been working remotely for nearly 2 months now is the best proof of this hypothesis that we could imagine. In fact, we've gone even further. Our 2020 summer internships are also all being conducted remotely as well. Previously, we'd considered internships to be one role which required an on-site physical presence. Because there definitely are advantages to having an internship in a physical office. So we recognize that this is a contingency arrangement and not our first choice. But the global situation has shown us that it's possible to open up remote work to roles which we never considered to be in scope when we launched the Remote Hub a year ago. And the reason that we've been able to move so quickly when adopting remote work in response to COVID-19 is because we already had the gears in motion. We didn't need to change direction. We were just applying the turbo booster to move everything that we already had even faster. So I began by promising you all the answer to 2 questions. The first was, why should remote engineering remote work be our long-term strategy instead of just a short-term contingency? And as you've now seen, remote work is a forcing function for good engineering practices. If you commit yourself to making remote work a first-class part of your company rather than just a temporary workaround, you'll be amazed by how much organizational momentum you're able to rally for top-notch engineering work. And the second question was, how do we work effectively as remote teams? I've shared with you a few of the specific strategies that we use at Stripe, and some of those may be helpful to you as well. But more flexible and powerful is the overall framework that we used to come up with those strategies. And be methodical, be rigorous. Don't try to change everything all at once. Instead, identify what's already working well for you, either offline or online, remote or in person, and figure out how to amplify that. If you do, you'll find that remote work isn't just an option that you happen to support at your company. It can be one of the most powerful and indispensable tools that your team has at its disposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya, for that talk on remote work. I really love the meeting style where everybody, even though some people might be in the physical office, but there'll be some meetings where everybody is fully remote so they can be on an even keel. And an absolute takeaway that I got from this that I think I'm going to actually start doing myself is the silent beginning so that everybody's on the same page and you can just kind of compose yourself before you jump into the work that y'all are doing synchronously. So now the questions that the people have been asking. People have been asking lots and lots of questions about working remotely. So I'm going to take the first one. The GitHub user's name is Tsunamimis. I can't pronounce that, sorry. How do you convince your company, especially one which is quite big, more than 100 engineers, to support an initiative like yours? How your remote teams can work efficiently with the on-site team? And they also want to know, how are you dealing with the different kinds of communication channels between the remote teams and the on-site teams? So let's just take the first one. How does one convince a company with a large engineering group of more than 100 people to take on creating a remote hub, Aditya?
So that's a very good question. I think that the answer for that is largely going to be situational. What worked for us may not necessarily be applicable to you. But the key is to figure out what your company actually cares about. What are the problems you're currently having, and figure out how remote work is going to help or amplify those. One way is career mobility or retention. Oftentimes, people will have to move in order to because of a significant other or family circumstances, and it really sucks to have to lose a lot of institutional knowledge that's been accumulated just because someone has to shift locations. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually keep that along and support them and provide these internal mobility options for them instead of forcing them to have to seek a job somewhere else? That's one angle that may work. Another way is to think about if your company is struggling with pretty brutal on-call rotations, think about how having people who are distributed in not just different time zones, but also different countries where you have different holidays, that might help. I will say that having time zones working across time zones presents a different set of challenges for teams. So you want to make sure you're prepared for those as well. But figure out what the pain points you're feeling are as a company and figure out how remote work can fit into those rather than trying to fit it the other way around. That's probably going to be the most successful way to approach a company that is reluctant or on the fence.
Shader.
Cool.
My man.
Yeah. So when I saw that Drake slide earlier and then I heard your phone go off, I thought you were going to do the hotline bling dance for us, but you didn't do it. So
not going to lie, I actually am on call today. Thankfully, though, I do have a backup. So this I think would be the first time that I've actually gotten paged during the middle of a conference talk.
Not so cool. I was just hoping for a dance. But the point you made about figuring out remote being synonymous with figuring out scale, I think you're right on. But what about the really small organizations who don't necessarily want to scale? Should they think about remote?
Yeah, absolutely. So I touched on this, but only briefly. You might be focused on just having a local market, or you might be trying to bootstrap yourselves and not growing very fast. But that doesn't mean that you don't want to be a flexible and adaptable company. Our current situation has shown us that markets can change, and whether that's because of something globally that's happening, or just the market that you're tackling, or just where you happen to be geographically. And remote work will free you from some of those limitations, not all of them, but it'll free you from a lot of them, and it will allow you to move much more nimbly at whatever scale you're operating than it would be if you'd focused your entire presence around having a physical office that is central to your workflows.
Yeah, that's right on. That's a good point. Moju, I think we got time for one more.
Yeah, just one more, a very short one. Have you discovered any downsides to remote work?
So I don't know if I would classify this as a downside, but something to be aware of is just it's not for everyone. In fact, it's funny because remote work isn't just I kind of conflated this, but it's not just working at home. It can also be working, at a separate space that's not your home. And this is something I personally have struggled with because I've been working remotely for 5 years, but normally in a co-working space. So in the last 2 months, adapting to working out of my apartment's been a big shift. So you have to keep in mind that people need the flexibility to ideally, people need the flexibility to set up their workspaces and their work situations the way they want. And some people might still prefer a physical office, but that doesn't mean we can't provide both options to people depending on what works best for them.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditya. That's going to be our last question.
Thank you.